Good day and welcome to Crapper. Today we're going to be doing something a bit different. I say we, it's just me. And that's the different thing. Normally we have debates. Tim, Peter, and Shaun, the Tim, Peter, and Shaun debates. And today it's just going to be me because the other two are busy. So I was trying to think about an album I could discuss. We'll see how long this monologue lasts, by the way. An album I could discuss that they might be slightly less interested in, and one which is sort of related to some of the other stuff we've been discussing, but which wouldn't have worked well as a group discussion. So I've chosen one from a different era because until now we've been discussing sort of 70s albums, British 70s albums, I should say. And today I'm going to discuss a very, very recent album, which I hope will provide a suitable topic for conversation and which might be of interest to people. It's an album that's a little bit difficult to discuss because there are differences between the style of this band and the style of the other bands we've been describing. Again, those are the sort of things that we can normally flesh out amongst ourselves, but we haven't got an opportunity to do that today. So I'm going to have to try and flesh it out, my thinking on this as much as I can. The album I've chosen is F.E.A.R by Marillion from 2016. F.E.A.R is an acronym, of course, F.E.A.R. It's an acronym, an obscene acronym, so I can't actually read it out just in case something bad happens to me. It's F everyone and run, which of course is a reference to Brexit, as far as I can see. So this is a very English album in the sense it's related to English. I should say British, not English. Although the band mentioned England, but this is related to British politics and a British current affairs. I actually did wonder whether that makes it a rather colloquial album to discuss. But it seems to have been very popular, above all amongst Marillion fans, although maybe most Marillion fans live in Britain. I don't know. I don't know anything about that. I'm just sort of speculating. Now, Marillion is a band that I have never. I'm straight away. I'm going on to thin ice. Marillion is a band that I've never particularly liked, and I have, although I can see that they have done, obviously their commitment to their own musical career is not quite the right word, maybe project, their commitment to their own musical project over the years has been admirable. They seem quite an admirable bunch. I mean, they seem like quite nice guys. That's what I always think about them. And also, I think that their albums often contain quite brilliant moments. I mean, they do have brilliant songs and brilliant moments on their albums. They've never impressed me very much as a band, and I've never really got into them because I tend not to get into bands that just for the sake of it, if you know what I mean. I get into bands because I really fall in love with something that they've done, and that's never really happened with me and Marillion. I've never fallen in love with them, with their project, even though, as I say, I've sort of admired bits and pieces that they've done. But something strange happened to me a few years ago when their last album came out, which actually, now that I think about it, I can't remember what date it was. An Hour Before It's Dark, it was called, and that came out in 2022. Yes, of course. Now that so 2022 was when I discovered Marillion, as it were, because suddenly I just saw their new album pop up online. Pop up, pop up, pick up. I saw their new album pop up online, and I thought, oh, Marillion, yeah, whatever. But then I thought, oh, I'll give that a try. And I completely loved it. And I thought it was, I just couldn't stop playing it An Hour Before It's Dark. And for the first time in my life, I thought, oh my God, Marillion are really good. And I just thought, yeah, I just thought it was a complete masterpiece. And I still feel that like that now. And then I discovered the album before it from 2016, which was F.E.A.R, right? And I liked that just as much. I thought that was just as much of a masterpiece. Um, Although, like, so I suppose really today I could have discussed An Hour Before It's Dark, but I felt like maybe I'd start with F.E.A.R, partly because it came first, but also because I think I like it even slightly more. It pips An Hour Before It's Dark to the post for me. One of the reasons why is because it's slightly longer. So it's all good, the whole album, and it's even longer. So it's like it's even more of a full meal, you know. I mean, if you're going to do a great album, which is quite an unusual thing to do, a great rock album, is an even better album if it's a double, for example. I mean, I'm very glad that Tommy by The Who is a double album, or The Wall by Pink Floyd. Um, so yeah, I thought maybe I'd just start with this one, because as I say, I liked it slightly more because of the length, really. Um, but yeah, I mean, I don't have anything else to say about the band Marillion, I don't think, because sometimes we start with a discussion on this channel. We start with a discussion of the band. They're often compared to Genesis, aren't they, Marillion? I think that's probably because early Marillion, with Fish as the singer, um, sounded a little bit Genesis-y because Fish sounded a bit like Peter Gabriel. But really, they've never had that much in common with Genesis. In fact, I think that they are, if you had to compare Marillion to anyone, I think it would probably be, it seems to me, it would be Pink Floyd, because I think their music is more similar to Pink Floyd in the sense that it's not as, their music isn't as elaborately composed as Genesis is. Um, and so it's more to do with texture and mood in a way that Pink Floyd uh, sort of were famous for. Not to mention the fact that that Marillion use a lot of minor chords. Minor chords, minor keys would be a better way of saying it. I mean, they play in minor keys a lot, so their music is sad sounding in a way that Pink Floyd's frequently is, and in a way that isn't necessarily, right? So yeah, coming back to the album itself, F.E.A.R, F.E.A.R, everyone, F everyone and run. Yeah, as I said, it's a masterpiece. It's I'm not going to do a Turner's turntable, except to say that it got to number 4 in the UK charts, which a stat that I found on Wikipedia, which is actually the best chart position for 30 years for a Marillion album. And I think that that's not an accident. You know, it's funny. I was saying this in the last episode, how you hear an album's chart position either in the UK or the US or something like that, and you think, yeah, that sounds about right. This sounds like a number 4 in the UK kind of album. Of course, it would have been higher if it'd been up to me. But anyway, yeah, I don't control these things. But yeah, I don't think it's an accident that they did so well with this album, because it's so great. And I read that it got 5 out of 5 stars in the Guardian. The sort of the liberal newspaper in Britain, the Guardian. and which is, I mean, superlative, really. They said it's a superlative, gave it a superlative review. I can't remember whether they used the word superlative, but they said it's their best album in 2 decades. Although according to the chart position, it's the best album in 3 decades. But the Guardian's not great with facts. That's a satirical remark. So in other words, I mean, it couldn't be better, this album, from a sort of critical or an audience perspective. I also discovered that it was crowdfunded, right? Which anyone who knows anything about Marillion already knows. So this ties in with the theme of the album, which has to do with partly to do with the new economic structures in contemporary societies. And so this is an example of the gig economy, isn't it? Which Marillion would presumably be all against, but they've used it to their advantage here, which is not a criticism. I'm just pointing out the irony. Now, I think that it's possible perhaps to talk about, before we get into the tracks, before I get into the tracks, I think I wanted to just say something about the writing style. I've said that they deal with texture and mood, Marillion, and I've said that they play in minor keys a lot. That's not terribly illuminating information. I do think their writing style is unusual, whether you like it or not. For example, it's completely different to the classical prog rock bands. Possibly with the exception, now that I come to think about it, of Van der Graaf Generator, who play in minor keys and are very moody. I'm not sure really whether I would describe Pink Floyd as a prog rock band. They're more of an art rock band, I would say. But maybe Van der Graaf Generator could be considered art rock in that sense as well. But it's a strange writing style. It's not terribly through composed. Their pieces are not terribly through composed. That's to say they're not dealt with as total structures in the way that you would get with a classical Genesis track, from the early 70s era, one of the longer tracks, where it would have been conceived as a whole, and any complications within that structure would have been seen as part of the overall structure. Excuse me. Marillion seemed to write sort of episodically, perhaps you could say. Almost, what was the style that was invented by Brian Wilson and Van Dyke Parks? Did they call it modular songwriting, where they just put a little bit of a song with another little bit of a song? You can see this, of course, in the Smile tracks from the Beach Boys, which were unreleased, to some extent on Smiley Smile, which was the released version of Smile by the Beach Boys, which came out in 1967. So that's to say that you're dealing with sort of fragments. They take fragments and then put them together. And sometimes these fragments, at least in terms of like the CD or the running order on Spotify or whatever platform you're using, sometimes these sort of fragments or kind of like conjunctions of fragments become whole songs. And sometimes these become whole songs within other songs, right? So it's almost as if they're, just dealing with sort of like just building things a block at a time, as it were. And then sometimes they stop and they go into a new track, some of which could be replete. So some of them could be quite short. That's certainly the case with this album, the one we're going to be discussing today, F.E.A.R. It's very unusual, that, and I don't really know what to make of it. They've been doing that since the beginning, really. Well, maybe not since the very beginning. I think they've been doing it at least since what's it called? Their third album, Childhood's End. Is that right? They started doing like sections within larger tracks, and as I say, when I discovered An Hour Before It's Dark and then Fear, this was the first time that this way of working began to make sense to me. I began to understand why they, or felt I began to understand why they were doing it. Um, the pieces that were built, constructed of other sections, seemed to be required to be taken as a whole. And then you would see all the fragments in the context of that whole, basically. However, they are still doing albums. And this is a curious paradox because if you, why would you, that would work to have songs constructed out of fragments plus some sort of individual songs, maybe, you know, a few singles or whatever. And you could put all of that presumably into a set and call that an album. But on the other hand, when Marillion did that in practice, it seemed that what they were doing was actually referring to things, fragments from other sections, other tracks in different tracks, as if you had sort of, don't know how to describe it. As you can see, I'm thinking out loud here. Almost like there's three levels, like you have songs built up of other songs, and then albums which are on some level of concept albums and seem to do make available fragments from certain songs in other songs and things like that. So it's a very weird approach, this. And as a lover of albums, it kind of makes sense to me. But then as a lover of sort of prog rock tracks, you know, constructed of different elements, I found it always all slightly confusing. I think that it reminds me actually of Frank Zappa, because Frank Zappa had this thing he used to call conceptual continuity, which is where he would do one song and then he would refer to that song in another song, as if really the controlling element in everything was him as an artist, right? Maybe that's what Marillion are trying to do, but I who knows? You know, who knows? I've never heard anyone discussing this or never heard them discussing it. But yeah, anyway, that's the main thing I wanted to say about the album as a whole. Except also to say, although this is related, I think it's impossible to separate the album from the lyrics, the album qua concept from the lyrics, because here it's the lyrics which refer between the songs. Actually, it's not the musical elements; it's the lyrical elements. And this album, F.E.A.R, is almost like a long poem, which you know, has sort of callbacks between the actual official songs, and it's got that feel of like a long poem set to music, really. But as I say, the music doesn't actually repeat, but the lyrics do, which is, again, I find slightly weird, but whatever, doesn't matter. Doesn't matter if I find it weird, does it? It's fine. It's what they do. And here they do it very well, I think. But I think for that reason, because it's a strange compositional style, I won't probably be talking about the music very much. I've made a few notes here, but they're all really to do with the lyrics. So let's start with track number one. The album has, how many tracks on it? Sorry, I should know this, shouldn't I? 6 tracks in total. Yeah, 6 tracks. I think 3 of them are just, as I say, replete tracks, and 3 of them are sort of bricolages, let's say. I'm supposed to talk about the cover as well, aren't I? There's not much to say about that, fortunately, because I'm not an artist, you know, a plastic artist, so I don't know much about visual art. But, well, I know what I like. The cover is simply, I think it works, the cover aesthetically. It's just a gold image, an image of gold. And then the imprint in the gold is the letters F.E.A.R. That's to say, fear. So, um, fear and gold are two fundamental tropes, let's say, two fundamental motifs on the album. And so they're kind of brought together in the cover. I suppose it raises the question of to what extent fear is related to gold. That's to say, money. And there are various references to that in the album by the band, but I don't know really what they mean. Yeah, so the first track is El Dorado, which is Spanish, isn't it? And actually, what does it mean? It doesn't mean the land of gold or something like that. I think it is because oro is gold in Spanish, isn't it? I'm going to give a little Spanish lesson now. And El Dorado, I think, is probably a reference to a place that they might have been trying to find when they were colonizing the New World or something like that. That rings a bell that it's something like that. I should have looked that up, shouldn't I, really? But yeah, obviously here again, we have the reference to gold, the land of gold. I mean, the land of gold here might be, I suppose, Britain, because that is Britain and England are themes that come up again and again, and they certainly come up in this first track. The track is divided into 5 sections. Long Shadowed Sun, number 1. Number 2, The Gold. Number 3, Demolished Lives. Number 4, Fear. Number 5, The Grandchildren of Apes. And Long Shadowed Sun, the opening, starts with the Sound of Birds song, and it comes in with an acoustic guitar. It's actually, in that sense, again, it reminds me of Pink Floyd. It reminds me of actually Grantchester Meadows off Amagama, partly because of those sound effects. And it's got this similar mood as well. And then they talk about England straight away. That section of the song is about England. It's about sitting in an English country garden, as it were. And so maybe England is El Dorado. I don't know. They go straight into the second section, Gold. I mean, straight into, obviously, they're all connected up, these bits, although they are sort of disjunctive. I mean, when one stops, the next one starts, you can see. I mean, there's no, as I think I pointed out earlier, there's no necessarily continuity between them. So yeah, there's a short opening, Long Shadowed Sun, which is like a prologue, and then it goes into The Gold, which is where the track really begins, I suppose, where the total track kind of begins to take off. It opens with a chorus about gold, which is reiterated later on in the section after the band has come in. So it's a sort of like, it's not unaccompanied, the chorus at the beginning, but it's got no drums. It's got no obvious rhythm, strong rhythm. Yeah, so the band comes in. It's just sort of slow 4, moody, again, Pink Floyd-y, slow 4 in a minor key. And obviously there's a critique here of money, right? So you can sort of see at this point the Marillion are, I suppose they're lefties, really, right? Which I think makes sense. I mean, they're from the north of England, I think. I should have checked that as well. Fish was from Scotland, wasn't he? The original singer. But I think Steve Hogarth, I guess the others are from the north of England. I don't know. But they're lefties, and as you'll see later on, they're also humanists, which perhaps goes together, and pacifists, which perhaps goes together. Now, the critique of gold here, gold is a stand-in for money, of course, actually made me think of the Rabbie Burns poem. There's a famous Rabbie Burns poem called Parcel of Rogues, which some people might know. Is the poem called that? Well, there's a folk song based on it called Parcel of Rogues, and I think that the poem might be called that as well, or at least, the lyrics of the song are from the poem. Um, and the poem goes, we're bought and sold for English gold, such a parcel of rogues in the nation, right? So this is the idea that we've sold our souls, sort of thing. In the case of Robbie Burns, it's a reference to Scotland being bought out, basically politically and economically, by England after the failure of Scottish colonization of Panama. I think it was the Darien Project. It's a famous sort of chapter in British history, that. Um, so there's a sort of critique of money in here. I'm talking, as you can see, I'm talking about the lyrics a lot, and not music so much, because this is all lyrics led. I mean, in a sense, this is a Marillion album, but this is a Steve Hogarth album as well, the singer, because he writes the lyrics. As far as I know, he writes all the lyrics, and he's really doing a lot of work on all of this. Not just setting up the themes, but also some of the tunes, in the sense, like some of the key melodic moments come from improvisations by him, it seems. And the music of Marillion often has the feeling of a backdrop for me, like a canvas. And it's quite a beautiful and quite effective canvas. But I think it wouldn't work so well if it wasn't for the lyrics. So I suppose that's why I've ended up talking about the lyrics here. Yeah, so where are we? Next section is Demolished Lives, which is about immigrants, right? So that's where, and then you get a repetition, a reiteration of the lyrics from Gold as well, with a slightly different slightly different melody and harmony. So again, you start to see a sort of some conceptual continuity here. The issue of immigration, people not being nice, humanistic to immigrants, is of course connected to the critique of money. It's kind of obvious, really. But that's the more fragmentary section. And then it goes into Demolished Lives, and then it goes into the key fourth section, which is sort of really the climax of the track, I think, which is called Fear again. So again, you see the conceptual continuity here. Fear, gold, etc. We're not quite sure. Sometimes you're almost not quite sure what track you're in. That's the feeling that I get. Now, Fear is a really sort of musically dramatic section of the piece, and not to mention of the album as a whole. This is the point at which you start to think, this is I'm here in the presence of a great album, in my opinion. By the way, these are all my opinions, as if that were necessary to point out. Yeah, so the track Fear opens with a sort of insistent repeated guitar riff, which is slightly atonal in structure. It reminds me a bit of I Want You, She's So Heavy, or maybe it's the She's So Heavy bit of I Want You, She's So Heavy by the Beatles off Abbey Road. And it kind of just builds up and builds up in volume, and more instruments come in. But because it's building up and it's very insistent and it has that atonal structure, it feels very paranoid, right? And it makes you feel slightly paranoid. And I think that's, again, that fits with the theme, because we're dealing with fear, aren't we? Although, I mean, technically fear is not the same as paranoia, I suppose. Lyrically, again, we've got a connection between fear and money coming in at this point. We've got fear, critique of money, critique of immigration policy. Now, what else? Some of these words are almost newspaperish. as if you're sitting in Britain reading the newspapers and just as if they're sort of just paraphrasing what they're reading in the newspapers. I think fear, bad immigration policies, whichever side you're on, money. I mean, we're definitely in England, aren't we? Um, Now, the chorus of this section, this fourth section, is much more tonal, and it's actually the loudest and the heaviest bit. So then it suddenly breaks into this sort of tonal section, which again shows Marillion's mastery of texture, I think. And that's a terrifically exciting moment. I think it's quite, I find it very affecting. A goosebumps moment, I think. Again, the sort of righteousness or perhaps self-righteousness, which is more pejorative, but I mean, sometimes it's difficult to tell the difference between righteousness and self-righteousness, although there is a difference. Um, that sort of sense of righteousness in the lyrics, possible self-righteousness, fits very well with this music, I think, because it gives it when it really gets loud and exciting, then you feel the sort of righteousness, flowing through you, flowing through them and through them into you, and it's a very affecting, I find. And then we have the last part, which is the grandchildren of apes, part five, and that's really an epilogue to the the apotheosis that comes in part four, fear. I hope I'm not losing you with all these sections. And this is the thing about Marillion is that you can feel like you almost could get lost in all these sections. But yeah, then it calms back down for this last bit. So this last bit is a sort of epilogue, really. So as I said earlier, we're dealing with tracks here that are not through composed, but they're sort of carefully programmed, I would say, and very effective. Going to move on to the second track, Living in Fear. Again, fear, conceptual continuity. To the point where you almost wonder whether you're still listening to the same song, whether you're still listening to the first song at this point. And but anyway, it seems to work. And this could be a standalone track, it's fine. Now here, this is Living in Fear is a sort of, I would say it's like a hippie-ish anti-war song, perhaps. Yeah, because when it builds up to a climax, he's sort of saying things like the Berlin Wall, the Great Wall of China, what was the point? So this feels, yes, it feels very hippie-ish, these motifs, because you don't have to be a hippie, I think, to critique immigration policy, if you know what I mean. But you have to be a hippie to be a romantic, I suppose. So to romantically critique immigration policy, you have to be a hippie. And rock bands often have a sort of hippie-ish side, don't they? So I think that's sort of coming into it here. It's a sort of what structure? Well, this song it's all in the same tempo, as far as I remember. The structure I've written down actually is A, B, A, C, B. So you get a sort of first section, and then you get a preface to a final section, section 5, coming in as section 2, and then section 3 goes back to section 1, and then there's a middle bit, a C section, which is different, and then a B section at the end. D section at the end. Oh no, sorry, B section because it's a reprise of what was sort of interpolated in the A section at the beginning. Now this is different from the normal Marillion practice because you can see that this is a through composed piece, and it's really great the way that it builds up, I think, and the way it ends in as again with a sort of maximum volume and maximum energy, and then to the point where it just stops because there's nowhere else for it to go. And again, it's sort of the apotheosis comes just at the moment that they're being at their most. Steve Hogarth is being his most righteous, or self-righteous, if you prefer. So it's very nicely done. Also, it goes into Chinese, I believe, at one point, and German. So, in order to point out, this message is universal, that we should all be on the same side, no matter where we're from. Again, hippie politics. I don't mean to be rude saying it's hippie politics. We all have a hippie side, don't we? But I think in the end, hippie politics was seen to be slightly naive and over romantic. In retrospect, all you need is love, etc., etc. I do wonder, even though I said it's like a properly through composed piece for once, I do wonder whether Steve Hogarth sort of overdetermined the structure. Again, the importance of the singing here is incredible, which is weird because he's not the original singer, right? As if Marillion was the continuity and the singer was just a secondary matter. Actually, in both cases, Fish and Steve Hogarth, the singing and the way that the lyrics and the tunes coming from the singer are constructed seem to play a very important part in the music itself, in the structure of the music itself. Perhaps even more with Steve Hogarth than with Fish, actually. So, for example, in this track, there's the vocal lines seem to be constructed as a series of variations, almost as if they're improvised. So it's like he's just folding the melody over and over again. Folds as the French philosopher Gilles Deleuze would call them, and each of these folds seems to contain its own treasure. And I wonder, again, I just raised the question. I wonder to what extent this was planned or not, which is a theme we come back to again and again in our on our channel and in our podcast. To what extent do these people know what they're doing? To what extent does any artist really know what they're doing when they're doing it? There's a popular theory that art. There's a thing that Jacques Lacan, the French psychoanalyst, called logical time of the subject, I think, which is that actually human intelligence only works backwards. You only realize retroactively what you've done. In the moment, you don't know. So any sort of genuine creation, subjective creation, artistic creation, for example, tends to be, in the moment of actually doing it, it tends to be a wager on what a future would be like in which the creation that you're engaged in would have already been completed, if you see what I mean. It's a sort of circuit. This is time as a circuit. And it's just very interesting to see when there's any subjective processes in play, like these artistic processes, to what extent they're actually in control of what they're doing, or whether they're as surprised by how amazing their work is as the rest of us. I sometimes think that, like, the best definition of an artist is the first person to realize that what they've done is worth paying attention to. Okay, track 3. Now this is probably my favorite track. This is The Levers. This is called. Straight away, we're in the question of Brexit. 2016, Brexit was the hottest topic in Britain, as anybody who knows anything about British politics or about Britain would know. It was just like the issue was just tearing the country apart at that point, in a way that I've never seen at any other point in my life, because Britain is a country where there's a sort of social consensus, a settled social consensus, probably has been since the Civil War, in the mid 17th century. And so it's a country with a fairly peaceful civic realm, not completely, and it probably shouldn't even be like that, but I mean, that's how it is, I would say. And the most controversial thing that has happened in my lifetime was Brexit. And obviously, they felt the same. So they had to write basically an album about it, but at least one song. But I think this song is also actually the centerpiece of the album in a sense, because all of the political stuff that comes up in the other tracks, even like immigration, as I say, the critique of money, critique of political economy, whatever it is, um, all of that stuff, that's also to do with um, Brexit, the way that people were feeling about Brexit at that point. Right? Yeah, this is the centerpiece of the album. It's my favorite track because the music is so exciting. I think, and it's got 5 sections. Number 1, Wake Up in Music. Number 2, The Remainers. Number 3, Vapor Trails in the Sky. Number 4, The Jumble of Days. Number 5, One Tonight. Okay, so remember all of those because we're going to come back to them in a minute. Wake Up in Music is again, it's sort of like a funky, goes into sort of funky Pink Floydy type emblematic chord sequence, C minor to F, very sort of moody opening. That's not the whole chord sequence, but that's the beginning of it. And yeah, it's funksome. That's a neologism, but it's funksome. This first track, it's they're funking it up, which, as you know, English people are very good at. They're very famously very funky people. And I think the main thing to say here about the lyrics is that what Steve Hogarth has done here is he's inverting the normal use of levers, right? So levers, not levers. The levers, the people who leave in the Brexit debate, were the people who wanted to leave the EU. So they were the people who wanted Britain to get its sovereignty back, and the Remainers were the people who wanted Britain to remain in the EU. So they didn't care about British sovereignty, apparently. Sorry, no satire. I'm going to try not to be satirical here. So now, what Marillion have done, what Steve Hogarth is although I think Steve Hogarth's probably like a spokesperson for the band in this sense, like politically and conceptually. He's using levers here to describe them, to describe Marillion, because he says we are the levers. So it's first person. He says, first person plural. We are the levers. We're the ones who leave. That's to say, we leave Britain, right? And the Remainers are the official leavers. So the Remainers are the ones who want to remain in their country. So they're being like polemical it's a polemical inversion, let's say, a rhetorical inversion. They're trying to change the meaning of these words. I mean, they're not trying to change the meaning of these words, but they are changing the meanings of these words, inverting the meaning of these words for the purposes of this song, right? So, there's a point where he says, he's setting up an anti-Brexit theme here. So he says, at the end, he says, be careful, we'll leave you, right? Okay, part 2 is the Remainers. Wake Up in Music, of course, is a reference to the fact that the leavers go to do interesting things like play music on the continent. It is true, whatever you think of Brexit, that it has made touring musicians' lives much more difficult. That's quite famous that that's happened. But that's partly because, to be fair, it was dealt with so ineptly by the British government that they didn't even make it easy for us. They wanted to pretend that they were more anti-Europe than they actually were. People like Boris Johnson, because he was actually a Remainer originally. So they did stupid like headbanging things, like make it impossible for people to tour or to get visas or to travel, which was pointless, whatever you think of Brexit. But anyway, it's irrational, So yeah, Wake Up in Music is about them leaving to go and do a tour in Europe, something like that. Now, the second part, The Remainers, is an interlude, right? This contains actually a threat to the actual leavers, right? This is the bit about be careful, we'll leave you. Is that right? Does that come out in that bit? Anyway, but so yeah, this is in a sense, this is the sourest moment lyrically. Because in fact, the whole track really is quite tender in a sense towards both sides, I would say, of the Brexit debate. It's a sort of call. Really, the whole track is, all five parts is sort of, to some extent, it's a hymn to forgiveness, I would say. Or is it? Because they're right at the end, and they put in a little. There's a little, twist right at the end where they end on a sour note. But anyway, I don't know. I think they're happy to leave it sort of fairly ambiguous, let's say. Yeah, so as I said, the second part is a sort of interlude. Now, the third part is called Vapor Trails in the Sky. Now, this goes back to the levers. This is so we've got the part two is a critique of the Remainers, and then part three again is a valoration of the levers, who here are Marillion, right? They call themselves Revelry's children, but again, I would say that's ambiguous. I don't think revelry is necessarily a good thing. They might think that it is, in which case they're being biased, but that might be their intention. I don't know. And then within part three, which could have been a part four. I mean, I don't really, these sections are all so fragmentary that I don't actually know even how they've chosen to subdivide them or why they've chosen to subdivide them. Although they could have chosen to subdivide them, they could have subdivided them according to the lyrical content. That would make most sense. Because this part, the third part, starts rocky, I think, if I'm not misremembering, but then it goes into an atmospheric section, quite a long atmospheric section, because this is quite long, this bit, I think. And it's actually strange at this point to hear a non-vocal section. It's quite a nice piece, it sounds quite pretty and everything. But you realize that you've been in the vocals really since listening to the vocalist almost since the album began, right? Which is quite a sort of strange thing, especially for sort of prog rock or neo prog rock or whatever this is. And then we go into part four, which is called The Jumble of Days. And again, we're back into the dialectic, so to speak, between the levers and the remainers. I think The Jumble of Days is a reference to the chaotic lives that the levers, lead. Members of Marillion, for instance. And again, it's sort of seen to be, I suppose, like something good, to be open to change and things. I mean, that's debatable, but that's what seems to be what they're wanting to say. But yeah, they say sort of the remainers are trying to tame us. Yeah. So I suppose that's fairly critical, isn't it? But again, I don't know. I always thought there's this famous series. I don't know if you've heard of it, called The Walking Dead. And I always thought The Walking Dead was an interesting title. I don't really know anything about The Walking Dead. I've never really watched it very much, but I like that title because it's a bit like, I thought it was ambiguous, like who is the Walking Dead? Is it the zombies or is it the people who are trying to escape them? So there's that thing about which side are you on? And actually, both sides could be right or wrong in their own way. Zombies are definitely wrong, but I just like that idea of like whatever description you have, it could actually apply to both sides depending on your position. Okay, good. So now, Jumble of Days is a rather, yes, it's a very sort of like loud and rocky section again. And what's weird about it, again, from the point of view of like how are they composing, is that they could have actually ended at that point. I don't really understand why they decided to do a part five, except that part five is a sort of logical conclusion to the piece, but musically, it could quite easily have ended at part four. There's no obligation to have a part five. It's not like they're contractually obliged to have a part five. So so you've got the question about the compositional method there, but also because part four is sort of big, loud, and resolute, but part five is sort of actually bigger and louder and more resolute, right? So you're asking why, both at the level of compositional technique, but also, thematically. And of course, there is a thematic reason for it, which is that this is the synthesis, this is the synthetic section, it seems. Because he ends up by singing, "We're all one tonight." So basically, and it's a very romantic ending at this point. There's some horns come in at one point that sound rather like a Peter Gabriel track, something like what was that Peter Gabriel track on the Millennium Dome thing? Father Son, was it? This song about his dad. It's got very beautiful, like what are they called? Brass band arrangements on it. This sounds a bit like that, and that's sort of supposed to sound very. It's not. That's not supposed to sound romantic, but it's supposed to sound very. I don't know, sort of texturally deep, I suppose. And I suppose that fits the romanticism of the theme, right? We're all one tonight. Although, again, there's a sort of final moment where they sort of twist it again after this sort of beautiful romantic. We're all one tonight. We could all live together in happiness if we wanted to. Human beings as such, but also like leavers and remainers in the Brexit debate. Or maybe the current members of Marillion, the former members of Marillion, or their entourage or whatever. I don't know. But yeah, so it's very romantic. But then there's a final twist where he says, "You might write to me, but I won't reply." I think that's almost the last line, actually. So it's like, yeah, let's keep in touch, but I mean, let's not hold our breaths. All right, good. Again, I'm sorry that I'm talking more about the words here than the music, but I can't think of anything else to do because the music is so abstract. It's so abstract. It's so difficult it's so fragmentary and therefore abstract. It's difficult to explain, to say much about it technically that would illuminate what the experience of listening to Marillion is actually like. Anyway. Okay, so track 4, White Paper. This is a discrete track. It's not made up of sections. I'd say this is my least favorite track. It seems slightly inconsequential to me. The lyrics are quite poetic again, but they're not really. This is a break, I would think, because this isn't really related to anything on the rest of the album, although there might be vague resonances. So it's more of an interlude, this piece. It seems to be some sort of a love song or a song about love going wrong, which I think, again, shows how sad this band are, how sort of like depressive they can be. But it's not actually directly related to any of the other themes. I think one of the reason it's an interlude partly because it's the opening is soft after you've got that big ending, part 5 of the Levers. Excuse me. I think my problem with it is just that when it starts, that opening soft section, and when the drums come in, again, slightly funky, quite funky drumming. They play very beautifully, Marillion, like the actual players are very tasteful, I find. The drumming, the guitar playing, piano playing, is all very tasteful. And that first bit, the soft opening with then the sort of funky drumming coming in, I think it's a little bit. I don't find it very musically interesting, that bit. Having said that, I do like the track, the second half of the track, which sounds a weird thing to say, but I think it's about, if I'm not mistaken, it's about 7 minutes, this track. So it could easily be a track of 2 halves, as they say in football. Um, but yeah, there's a bit in the middle where he goes, "What's the matter, darling?" And then at that point, it kind of changes theme, changes mood a bit. And actually, the second half is more musically satisfying, I think. But again, as you can see from me saying, "What's the matter, darling?" There's a lot of pathos in the lyrics here, a la Pink Floyd again. Now let's move on to the final big track, right, which is the New Kings. Um, Now this is probably the darkest and most pessimistic track on the album. I love it. It's a great track as a whole, I would say, but it's very dark. The New Kings is obviously referenced to the new aristocracy. So I think that they are, and it's an aristocracy of money, of course, as you would expect in capitalism, rather than an aristocracy based on prestige, you know. Um, and I mean, in a sense, again, Marillion is sort of swimming in the contemporary debates about inequality of wealth around the world and in specific countries. You wonder whether they've read Thomas Piketty's book on, Thomas Piketty's survey of contemporary social and economic inequality, which is called Capital in the 21st Century, where he specifically says, like, we're basically dealing with a like a new aristocracy here. We're dealing with like this. We're reaching a level with the division of wealth which is almost pre French Revolution. I don't know whether he uses those terms, but I might be thinking of Alain Badiou, the French philosopher. But I think Piketty basically. I've read the book. I just can't remember it. It's so long. There's so much in it. But I think he's sort of, let's say it's a common trope. So it's shared amongst a lot of sort of left wing authors, left wing academics. It is strange to hear a pop band giving a critique of the banking sector, but that is what we get here. It's a sort of darkly satirical track. It's a bit where they just sing greed is good, that's in part two. Sorry, yeah, it's got four parts. First part is called Fear. Again, it's not. It's called F Everyone and Run. Again, you can see the conceptual continuity, to quote Frank Zappa again. But yeah, this time it's not Fear, it's F Everyone and Run specifically. Again, I don't know if I've mentioned this, but F Everyone and Run is a reference to Brexit, because it's just like, yeah, we don't care about the rest of you, we're going, which ironically is what Marillion claimed to be saying that they're going to do themselves, as if it's all right for them, but it's not all right for the rest of us, so it's one rule for Marillion, one rule for everyone else. So we got F Everyone and Run. I'm trying not to swear. 2, Russia's Locked Doors. 3, A Scary Sky. And 4, Why Is Nothing Ever True, which is a heavy title. I think one of the interesting things thematically here is that this track, you see, this is what makes me think it's not a concept album exactly, but it makes me think the album's very carefully programmed. So Marillion are very good at moving from one thing to another, as it were. And I think that they show that not just within the tracks themselves, the extended tracks, like the tracks with sections, the modular tracks, but also within the structure of the album itself. Because the apparent dispute that's set out in the New Levers about Brexit is here completely engulfed, right? It's completely engulfed in the question of money at this point and the new aristocracy. So it's a bit like, doesn't matter. It's almost like the band is saying, it doesn't matter what you think about this or that, Brexit, again, for Brexit, anti-Brexit. In the end, the money men are going to win out, this new aristocracy. Again, I don't know if that's intentional, but it's certainly, there's definite thematic resonance of that here. It's got a sort of, I said it's very dark. It's got a very desperate feel to this track. It starts in A minor and then moves to F sharp minor. So basically, you just got a sort of that's unusual for music like this, you know, to just move from one minor key to another, because it's a kind of it's like a clash, really. It's a sort of logical clash. There is a logic to it. It's not a relative minor to the major. F sharp minor would be a relative key to A major. A minor to F sharp minor is not relative. There's definitely a clash, and it's a very specific kind of musical clash, and it sounds very dramatic. And I think really they're using it to enhance the sense of chaos here, really. That's the key change going into the chorus. So there's a sort of it's structurally important, that feeling of desperation, you know, and chaos, really. By the way, talking about British politics, I noticed a reference in this part to Tony Blair. It's so parochial because they say Anthony, not Tony, not Anthony, or something like that, which is, I think, a reference to Tony Blair. So, you know, no one comes out of this unscathed, although, you know, Tony Blair was probably responsible for a lot of the problems that they're complaining about. But anyway, that's another matter. Let's not get political. Now, second part is Russia's locked doors. So we've got references to Russia here. Obviously, one has to be careful because there is a sort of cliched Russophobia in Britain, not to mention in America. And I don't like to think that they're participating in this, Marillion. I don't think that they are, though, because I think the reference to the sort of oligarchical character of Russian wealth is well taken. You know, I mean, it's pretty indisputable, whatever you think about Russian politics, you know. It's a solid enough reference. Now, at the end of this all this sort of crashing of between minor keys in this part is very moving. Once again, like at the end of part 4 of the New Levers, they could have left it here after 2 parts, which again raises the question of the compositional technique. What exactly are they doing? It's not always clear. Although I did say at the beginning of all of this that this is the first time that Marillion's technique, compositional technique, has started to become clear to me. I think that what it is that I think that they've got a series of sections, fragments, which I guess what they do is add lyrics afterwards. Or there's a sort of, perhaps again, a dialectical process in which they're writing some lyrics for some bits and then thinking, oh, whether we put that musical bit there to represent a change in the lyrics or something like that. And then if they decide that they are going to, that there's something better, something stronger, or something which logically should follow something else, then they start, you know, putting the tracks together in that sort of modular fashion. I did once see an interview with them where they said that they send each other fragments through the post. I mean, not through the post, via email, let's say, and they all have to rate the fragments that they send each other. And then the fragments that most of them like are the ones that they work on, which is very sort of that's weird, isn't it? That's a weird way of working. It's like I think it's perfectly feasible artistically. You know, you can work in by committee artistically. That is possible. Although I tend to think that art often works better when there's a controlling member. You know, when there's somebody who's not a dictator, but because you can work sort of democratically in artistic circles, but somebody who is able to get an overview and say, yeah, well, that's great, but we've definitely got to do this. You know, I think there's a sort of limit to how democratically you can compose music, I suppose, but might be wrong about that. So obviously what happened here was, in this track, somebody decided there's something else we've got to say here. There's something else that's got to go afterwards. Plus, maybe they're at the point in their career where they're thinking, okay, let's do a sort of long track here. And long to them is like 15 minutes. Okay, so let's do a 15-minute track here. Let's do a 20-minute track here. Let's, you know, because that can be a way of working as well. This is like your horizon. and sometimes it changes. But you think, oh, okay, let's put some formal constraints down so that we can actually start to work. Otherwise you wouldn't know where to begin, would you? Um, so they don't end there. They go into A Scary Sky, part 3. Um, this is a real clash, which again makes me think that the track could have ended at the end of part 2. There's a dramatic key change between the end of part 2 and the beginning of part 3, which is almost illogical. It's logical enough because part of the logic is we're stopping that bit and we're doing another bit now. So that's fine. That makes sense logically. But again, I think at this point they seem to want to ratchet up the drama in this third part, which really it's the only way you can continue the piece actually at this point, because we're coming to the end of the album now, so they've got to do a sort of dramatic end, right? By the way, I noticed another Beatles reference here. We saw the crash on the news today. Oh boy, I say another Beatles reference because I noticed another one earlier on, but I forgot to mention it. Oh yeah, in the Leave, as they say, we will make a show. That's definitely a reference to the Beatles going to Hamburg. That's my wager. Okay, good. And there is a sort of this piece, part 3, seems to end on a sort of note of optimism, like you feel like there might be a reprieve coming here. But actually, once again, when you get into part 4, which is called, oh God, I've forgotten, sorry, Why Is Nothing Ever True, which is a really depressing title, isn't it? It's just a series of like soaring, very dramatic minor chords, almost melodramatic. And yeah, I mean, the most depressing lyrics possible. Let me just see if I can find them. Bear with me. Really, is this it? Yeah. Remember a time when you thought that you mattered, believed in the school song, die for your country, a country that cared for you, all in it together? If it ever was more than a lie or some naive romantic notion, well, it's all shattered now. It's all shattered now. Why is nothing ever true? Do you remember a time when you thought you belonged to something more than you, a country that cared for you, a national anthem you could sing without feeling used or ashamed? You poor sods have only yourselves to blame. On your knees, peasant, you're living for the new king. I mean, you couldn't imagine a more depressing end to the themes on the album, could you? But again, there's a sort of, what's it called? Catastrophism. You know, there's probably a sort of catastrophist bias here. Like, let's say everything's gone totally wrong. And then, right, so where do you go from there, sort of thing? But generally, that's not considered, by most sort of intellectuals to be a very productive approach, let's say. But this is art; they can do what they want. I mean, a lot of these resonances are political, but in the end, we're dealing with an artistic product here, so it's not doesn't obey the same rules. They don't have to necessarily be saying something political all the time. Yeah, so everything ends here in chaos in the fourth part, a bit like The Wall by Pink Floyd. Although there is an epilogue, which is track 6. And again, you call it an epilogue, don't call it an epilogue, call it an epilogue because it's a standalone track. It's definitely a standalone track, which is supposed to go at the end of the album, once all of the other stuff has been said, right? So to this extent, again, we're dealing with, a concept album. And it's a soft track, this sort of like a play out track, let's say. Is that the word? Is that the phrase? and the lyrics reprise the lyrics from the New Levers. So my God, yeah, talk about conceptual continuity. This seems to be the sort of they're going for the ultimate synthesis here after the sort of chaos of the previous mega track. Let's create a new country and go there. That seems to be the theme. You know, as if we could overcome our differences if we all got engaged in a new project together, which is probably true and quite a nice idea. But again, it's rather romantic and um, I think it's not completely heartfelt because I think that the idea really, the sense I got from reading the lyrics, Steve Hogarth's lyrics, is that the damage that's been done here by Brexit, according to him, you know, according to him and people who think like him, is too deep really to be overcome. So it's sort of, I would say, like bittersweet ending, but it's more bitter than sweet, I think. Um, it's also paradoxical because there's an echo here. I'm sure Tomorrow's New Country is the name of the track, and um, it echoes this novel, The Go Between, which was an English novel from the 1950s, and which has got a famous opening, which is the past is a foreign country. Foreign country, they do things differently there, right? So this it's this sort of play between space and time, basically. So the idea that we might be able to engage in a final synthesis where we all become friends again is perhaps paradoxical or aporetic, let's say. Anyway, in conclusion, I would like to say that this is a very beautiful album, which I very much recommend. And I'll see you very shortly for another edition of Crap. I have to go now because there's somebody at the door. Goodbye.